Probably knows it. Yeah. It's amazing.
No, you're the one that's
Okay, guys, so let's start. So today it's a huge honor for us to host Professor Dan Klein from George Mason University. For two reasons, well, actually for at least two reasons. First reason, George Mason is a top school, so it's very rare for us to host someone from a school like that. George Mason recently has become R1 school. It means Research 1 school. It means among top research schools. So, and second reason, Professor Klein, he has published many papers. He also editor of a very well-known journal. It's called Economics Journal Watch. So it's actually available online. So what I recommend you doing after this guest lecture, go online and find a couple papers. It's actually really cool journal. Most of the time economic journals are really boring to read. That's one of the few journals actually kind of cool to read and cool to read, and it's really cool to talk about it. Okay, I don't want to take too much time. I just want to tell you, don't worry, you can always come and get seconds, so it's normal. It's kind of normal practice for us. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Klein.
I hope everyone can hear me okay. You, sir, can you hear me okay? Yes. Yeah, good. It's delightful to be here. I walked around Audubon Park yesterday. Gosh, that was magnificent. And just going along St. Charles Avenue is really quite breathtaking. It's pretty unlike anything else I can think of in the United States. Maybe there's some other places around this state, but anyway, it's a big audience. Gosh, you guys got a healthy econ club. Congratulations to Anton. There you go. And it's an honor to be here. I never spoke at this school before. It's an honor to see some of my old friends here in their own digs, like Walter Block, who I learned from when I was your age or even younger, reading Defending the Undefendables and getting my first lessons in free market economics. And Nick Capaldi, who I hosted in California, he spoke on John Stuart Mill there, and I had the pleasure of hosting him again recently at George Mason, where he spoke on his recent book on the liberal individualist tradition. So it's great to be among friends. Anyhow, we've got a very important topic to talk about. It's much more important than the press it gets. People don't complain that much. They don't focus that much on occupational licensing. It's a great deal more importance than people realize. Approximately 30% of the workforce is in licensed occupations. It's way bigger than the portions covered by the minimum wage or by unions. Yet it gets a lot less study and attention than those topics. Why that isn't entirely clear. One reason is that it happens state by state. So the stories vary by each state, and perhaps researchers don't have an incentive to focus on the topic because the story they tell might be focused on just one state. The laws are very particularistic, kind of detailed. And also it's getting at a problem, the assurance of quality and safety, which is a very subtle issue, I would say. And people have trouble wrapping their minds around it. I'm not sure I've wrapped my own mind around it. I've tried. I've written about assurance. But it's a tough, subtle issue. It's useful to think of three levels of control for these occupations. The lightest is mere registration, where you don't do that much more than sign up and be officially recognized, register that you're doing it. There might be some small fees, but it's pretty much still free entry. There's just registration. Certification is being able to claim a certain certificate, like animal health technician, which you've gone to school for, you've jumped through a whole bunch of hoops, you see some of the requirements there. It might be quite expensive and quite time-consuming. It also might be rather unpleasant in certain ways, just in the sense that the schools that you have to go to maybe are not that effective or not that reasonably run. So the costs of even this can be high, but then when you get your certificate, you can say, I'm a certified animal health technician, and sell your services on the market that way. But certification, generally speaking, doesn't privilege certain practices. I guess the only thing it privileges is saying, I have this certificate. It doesn't preclude other people from doing what the animal health technician does. You see, so people can do what they do, they just can't say, I'm a certified person to do it. Okay? So this level allows other people to do the service. It's a credential that people opt for because it'll help them sell their services in the market. And then licensing is the next major level, where if you don't have the license, you can't do it. It's permission. Without this, you don't have permission. You're not allowed to, whiten teeth and do all the things that are licensed. There's so many, as we'll see. The restrictions, therefore, keep people out of the trade, people who don't have the license. They cover the scope and manner of practice. How exactly this is done is a bit complicated, and it's a matter of turf wars between sometimes competing occupations. And sometimes there are other restrictions as well on practicing. So again, it gets complicated. Here's a U.S. Department of Labor website which tells you a lot about, on a state-by-state basis, about particular licenses. These states were the ones with the most licenses required in this particular study. These ones were the least. So states do vary in this respect. Overall, there are some 700 occupations licensed in some state or another. These are the heaviest licensing. These are the least. You can see Louisiana's falling about in the middle by this metric. Okay, so what is the rationale for this? Why should these restrictions on freedom of association, on freedom to go into business and sell your services, exist at all? The rationale has to do with protecting the consumer. That supposedly these trades, these occupations, these procedures that people do in them are specialized, they're hard to understand, it's hard to assess whether someone's really competent, and the licensing is there to protect you from the charlatans and the quacks. If we didn't make sure they weren't charlatans and quacks, they would be out there and you would, so they say, falling into their traps of buying their services, paying them for maybe something worthless or even something dangerous. That's basically the rationale. Supposedly consumers cannot judge quality and safety before the fact. Sometimes you can't even judge after the fact. We have to admit that. Sometimes you don't even know if you got good service. It's actually true. So I don't really want to necessarily say all this is false. I think we do have great problems in knowing what we're getting and in knowing what we're going to get. But does that justify this kind of restriction on individual liberty? Is that the solution? What you get, and sort of something of the ethic of the whole matter, is that we need a rule of experts, people who are experts in these fields, to say who's qualified and to guide us, to guide society. What's interesting is that economists really don't know, very few economists at all really support occupational licensing. Many criticize it, even reject it altogether, and they've written up these criticisms. And what's quite remarkable is that there aren't really other economists on record standing up and defending occupational licensing. There's quite a bit of opposition from particular economists, and there's almost no real defense from particular economists. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you ask an economist at random, like if you go into the economics department, well, maybe not at this university, but let's say you went to Tulane, and you pulled him out of his office for a second and said, occupational licensing, for or against? He might say for, but you realize that that's a random economist. It's maybe on this issue someone who doesn't know that much more than the average person on the St. Charles streetcar. It's another academic, right? They haven't necessarily studied it and seen what economists who study it really say and show. My point is that those who do study it, I think really do show something, do mount a very powerful criticism of it, which again, hasn't really been answered. And by the way, it's very old. It goes all the way back to Adam Smith. We've talked about the official interpretation of this whole set of policies. The skeptical interpretation is that it's protecting practitioners, that it's privileging people from competition, keeping out new entrants, and restricting other people in related fields from basically competing for their customers. You've heard this story a million times, I'm sure, as econ students. Rent-seeking, privilege-seeking, capture theory of regulation. I think this is basically on the mark in this case. But we want to go through it. Now, but before we turn to all the economic rationale, let me be a little bit personal and say that the capture theory, the rent-seeking theory, the problem with that theory is that it can come across as sounding like, oh, you've got these manipulators working the system, things up to line their own pockets. They get these higher incomes, they keep out competition, they laugh all the way to the bank. And that's not what it looks like when you hit the ground, when you talk to the people on the licensing board, when you talk to the people with the licenses, like my dad, a pediatrician, now retired. I argued with him, when I was a college student, I was reading Walter Block, I was like, Dad, occupational licensing, we shouldn't have it. It actually drives up the costs of medical care, it reduces innovation, it increases prices, it reduces the supply, et cetera, it holds people back who don't have advantages to go to medical school like you did. And he says, no, we need it. And I don't think it's because he really thinks, oh, it was a good deal for me, it made me richer. He believes it. And so people buy the first rationale, the official rationale, and I think people in the trade are especially seduced by it because they are the ones protecting society. They're also the ones who get to enjoy a certain privilege, kind of like deputization from the government on high, one of the official licensed doctors who can prescribe drugs to the American people. So this whole matter of a kind of feeling of expertise and leadership is, I think, part of it. And so the psychology is, of course, really much more complicated than the simple economic criticism might make it sound. This whole matter gets us into a whole set, a much larger issue of really this matter of assuring quality and safety. The whole matter of there being a demand for the assurance of quality and safety. What do I mean by that? You all were hungry 20 minutes ago, you hadn't had lunch yet, you were ready for lunch. And let's say you weren't coming here and didn't find this here to satisfy that hunger. Suppose instead you were out doing your own thing, you went on the sidewalk,
You were hungry. What did you have? Did you have some of this one? You didn't have any. What did you have? All of it. Everything. Okay. So you're walking along trying to satisfy your wild hunger, and there on the sidewalk is a plate that looks exactly like the plate you just had, right? And let's say it actually was just like that food that you just ate. We'll assume that. We get to write this story, so we assume that. Would you eat it? No. No. It's the good you want. It's the good you just ate. But you wouldn't eat it, even if the price was zero. Why not? Because he doesn't have this. He doesn't have assurance of the quality and safety. So not only did he have a demand for food, such as he ate, he has a corresponding demand for the assurance of the quality and safety of that food. And you got to conceptualize that as a kind of separate demand. Like, you know, this mussels, rice, and then assurance of its quality and safety. And that goes for everything you consume. And how is that? We know something about, we can kind of talk about how people produce this by cooking this stuff up and getting their supply chain, putting it all together, mixing it up in a pot. But how do people produce assurance? And one way they do it is by having long-standing businesses with reputations, with good reputation, by doing it in the past, by having other sorts of certifications. In fact, it's a very complex, multifarious process. There's a lot of different ways to assure things. And now, of course, we have Yelp and everything on the web, so that as soon as you get poisoned, you can damage that reputation. The point is that this is out there, and not only is there a demand for that, you know, you're con students, what does the demand create? Opportunities for profit by supplying. So the demand for assurance creates profit opportunities for supplying assurance, and I submit that that's exactly what we see all around us all the time in many different ways. And it actually works generally pretty well. And these different ways, I think, work certainly well enough such that the occupational licensing is a problem. I'm talking about these ways in particular. Again, there are many different ways. I'll show you a slide in a second. Of course, there's also this, but then there's also this, which occupational licensing is an example of, which I'm generally very hostile to. For example, something very parallel is our pharmaceutical policy, FDA policy, where Congress has banned all new drugs. And to get onto the market, they need permission from the FDA. That's the same kind of thing. Just like you're getting permission to be a lawyer because of occupational licensing, they're giving people permission to produce a drug. It's the same kind of rationale, and I think it's weak in the same kind of ways. So what we're talking about today generalizes to many other issues. So on that list, just a second ago, this first thing, I don't have time to go into detail, but there are just tons of ways in which people assure quality to satisfy that demand for assurance, so that trades can be made and mutually advantageous exchanges and relationships can be achieved. You're all in school right now. What are you doing? Are you here just to learn? No, actually. A lot of you are here just to certify your quality, right? You're going to come out of here with a degree. That's like a certification. It's a credential. You're paying for it. You're going to come out with a transcript. You're going to come out presumably with letters of recommendation. You are investing in supplying the assurance of your own quality right now. Okay? And you can look at just about everything in the market this way, where the supply and demand of assurance in the activity. So there's a whole lot of ways this exists. I know that's kind of hand-waving, but I'm ready to defend it if we have the time. Of course, there's this as well, working for occupations. Doesn't work necessarily very well, but... and so we have these other mechanisms. The first two, going back to these, are they working so badly such that this achieves something that's worth the costs of that third thing? Okay, it must be that occupational licensing makes better service better enough to redeem the costs of occupational licensing. But when we look at occupational licensing, there's so much to doubt this. These are some of the things that this outlines what's coming here. It's mostly practitioners who demand licensing privileges. It's not consumers rising up and saying, we need protection, we need protection. Time and again you see this, okay? Like you see a lot of Uber people, a lot of Uber customers rising up and saying, oh, we need to keep Uber out of our city. No, right? It's the same kind of thing. It's a taxi cab. The people with the current privileges who want to be kept out. Yeah. This is an individual, and I'll skip over that. Generally, these laws come in and grandfather in the existing practitioners. That's called grandfathering, such that they get permission without having to jump through the newly established hoops. So they don't have to incur the costs of the new hoops that are established, the new requirements. Meanwhile, anyone who now wants to compete with them has to do that, and that limits the competition. People have studied the entry requirements for getting a license, and there's a great deal of criticism about the relevance of the different requirements, about the exams not really showing that you have what it takes to be a good practitioner. A lot of funny business about how the rates at which people are passed on these exams sometimes vary with the conditions in the occupation, as though it's more concerned about the incomes of the practitioners than about protecting consumers. These requirements that have existed have been challenged, but just the fact that they've existed, why does citizenship and residency in Louisiana matter? Do you think that your Mississippian plumber is such a bad plumber because he doesn't know Louisiana? Are the pipes in Mississippi so different that we've got to protect ourselves from those Mississippi plumbers? Why would residency in the state even be a factor? What does this tell us? Really, what's going on here? Again, the exams often don't test real content, and they can never test for diligence on the job. People learn to do good on the exams. Schools specialize to do good on the exams. Does that mean that 5 years later, when they're on the job in your backyard, they're going to be diligent and honest? No. How does the exam assure that? So there's these entry requirements of different sorts that just, if you think about it, don't really assure what they're trying to assure. Economists study the effect of incomes, and where occupational licensing is strongest, you can compare state by state, cross-sectional. The incomes are higher, the prices are higher. Again, what does this tell us? Gordon Tullock interpreted the matter in what he called the transitional gains trap. When it first comes in, the first transition to the system, there are gains to the people who get the privileges, the gains to the people who are grandfathered in. After those people pass, the next generation, let's say now all the dentists have to go through all these requirements and get all these licenses to do the things that dentists currently do. Does the next future generation of dentists necessarily gain much from from this system, actually. Think about this. I know you're thinking, well, dentists are high paid. They seem to be doing pretty well. But you know what? Dentists are very studious, smart students in general. And you got to ask, what would those kind of people who go to dental school and become dentists be otherwise? And the point is that now they enter a system where they have to incur the costs of jumping through all the hoops, and then they do get higher incomes because of the restrictions on competition. But on the whole, are they really better off? And Tulloch suggested that no, actually it's only the first generation that's really much better off, that gets the initial gain of being privileged without having incurred the costs. And then the world and human history goes on without any actual big gainers. However, if you tried to reverse the system, as we would like to do, as I would like to do, you're going to hurt the current people who have incurred the costs. The dentists who have gone through dental school, have gone through all the requirements, have gotten the privilege, are protected from competition if you now say we're going to take that away. Just as there was a transitional gain at the beginning, there'll be a transitional loss from ending it. So they fight ending it. Even though, ironically, no one is really in their lifetimes any longer gaining that much from this system. You see what I mean? So it's a very tragic situation where a greedy group and foolishness in government implements a system which benefits really just a transitional group. According to this story, of course, it's not exactly as simple as this, but this is Tulloch's basic idea. It's a very important thing to understand. That's what's the problem with Uber and the taxis. They are now, the licensed taxis are now the ones who have had the privileges, have paid for their licenses, and now are they going to be inundated by Uber and destroyed by Uber? If you let that happen, it'll be good for Uber drivers, it'll be good for all consumers, it'll be bad for those taxi drivers, and they're fighting it. And in some cities and states, they're winning, not in all. And I think it's a losing battle in the long run, but that's exactly what's happening. Tulloch's transitional gain trap, the trouble of getting out of this system. The licensing boards themselves are made up of people from the occupation primarily. When you look at what they do, they mostly prosecute unlicensed practitioners. You'd think if they're about protecting the consumer, they would be focusing on their licensed colleagues who are ripping people off. But that's not what they do. They protect their own, and what they try to do mostly is fight unlicensed practitioners regardless of complaints of quality. It's a very strong in-group ethic. Being a doctor's son growing up, I knew that very clearly. And they tend to just try to protect their own. Doctors are one thing that people maybe have a little hard time swallowing. The abolitionist position, like abolishing occupational licensing, but these other ones seem like a laugh to me. Athletic trainer, auctioneer, barber. Have you ever been really afraid that your haircut's going to be so terrible that we need to keep people out of the barbering? Casket seller, lobster seller, rainmaker. There's a rainmaker down here, licensed rainmakers. What's going on here? Okay, the costs, again, I've said they raise prices. There's a bunch of studies showing this. Even the Canadian Office of Fair Trade finds this on average. That's worse for all consumers. And it's not just a higher price, that also means a reduction in quantities transacted, right? It's also a reduction in quantity. You got to keep that in mind. It's not just that everyone gets what they have gotten. Longer waits, harder access, and so on. Innovation is slowed. Morris Kleiner shows this in his more recent work, empirically. Obviously, negative consequences for the poor because prices are higher for everyone who pays for these services. Again, this is throughout the economy. I mean, this is everywhere. prices are higher, and furthermore, it makes it harder for poor people to find their way into these trades. You know, richer people have an easier time to jump through the hoops, to go to school, to pass the requirements. They've got mommy and daddy helping them up. Like my colleague Walter Williams always says, what we want is an economic ladder with all the rungs in place, so that even people who are low down on the economic ladder can find the rungs to climb up. Well, if you take away all the lower rungs, and you know, think about some lower people here, they don't have mommy and daddy lifting them up to the first rung to clamber up. They might get more stuck in poverty, and this is exactly what occupational licensing does. It tends to make it harder for the least wealthy people to get going and to start learning what they're good at, to start learning work skills, and so on. Benefits. If there's any justification, it's got to be shown in benefits. Does it improve quality? Now, there's two ways to interpret this issue. Does occupational licensing improve quality? One, are the licensed services in states with licensing higher in quality than those in non-licensing states? That's one way, and you can try to study that. But there's a broader way. Is the quality of service received by consumers higher in the licensing states than in the non-licensing states? That's a different question. Look at the first one first, and remarkably, where occupational licensing is stronger and higher requirements, it is not found that the licensed services there are better quality than the licensed service in the more liberal states. And I mean liberal in the liberalization, letting people do their thing states. It's quite remarkable, but that's found throughout. But what's even more striking is the second kind of quality question. What do you do in these high licensing states when prices are high and maybe it's small supply and inconvenient? So this is the other question of the actual quality received by consumers. What do you do? When it's high price, you can't pay for it, or it's inconvenient, you hire an illegal. You get a friend to do it. You do it yourself. Or you go without. Okay, so this broader question and the realer question, how do consumers actually do where licensing requirements are tougher, has been studied, and strong evidence has shown that people do suffer. This famous paper, for example, showed that in states where electrician licenses were higher, there were higher rates per capita in the population of death by electric shock. In the home, people electrocuting themselves. Now, what's the logic here? Why would that be? Can you explain it for me? Yeah.
Because they resort to doing their own work on their own.
Exactly. Because the prices of electrician services are higher in the higher licensing states. Your people are more likely to do it on their own, or get a friend to do it, or get an illegal to do it. You know, someone without a license to do it. And they're more likely to electrocute themselves doing it. And similar evidence of this kind can actually be found. And it makes a lot of sense once you stop and think about it. So when you think about the broad question of quality, there's not even evidence that it's better. Meanwhile, we know there's all those costs that we've talked about. Also, another cost is that it creates black markets. Not that this is necessarily a huge problem of, you know, the unlicensed plumbers gang, but still, it does create problems where maybe people dispute a contract. Gee, you said you'd build a deck this way, but you didn't.
Well, now they might mistrust each other because the guy's unlicensed and he's very afraid, might make threats now, who knows what happens, because they're outside the law. Again, this Canadian office remarkably found that these impacts on quality were generally negative or neutral. So folks, we've shown that the costs are high. I mean, we've argued that the costs are high. There's a lot of evidence that the costs are high. The only way to redeem this is with high benefits. The benefits are like zero by all studies on the whole. You know, Robespierre once said, one can't make omelets without breaking a few eggs. That was like his remark about the French Revolution. Got above people's heads. You gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. Where are the omelets? There's no omelets from this policy. And again, I know you know I'm a free marketeer and I have my biases, but you won't find an economist standing up there and countering this general case that Milton Friedman and Adam Smith have been making forever. And that the evidence, even some of the Democratic economists like Alan Kruger have been criticizing occupational licensing lately. So there are no omelets. We've talked a little bit about this. I won't go into Adam Smith, he's really good on this. Friedman too. We've talked about this. Here are a couple of the more mainstream guys who have been pro-liberalization lately. Klein is really the leading researcher on the matter. Okay? So I don't think there is a rationale in economic theory in the end. Yes, we do have trouble judging quality, assuring ourselves of quality. It's a challenge. Does the government's unique powers in any way help meet this problem? You know, some arguments for government intervention, I think, make a lot more sense. People say, for example, that more basic science would benefit society because there's positive externalities. And a bunch of people benefit from basic science in all these diverse ways of the nice things that get developed from scientific research. Those benefits are not fully rewarded. And so there's an argument there for government to use its one special ability. Think about it, it's really only about one special ability, which none of us have. And that's the power to coerce people. And this argument for basic science says that special ability can actually be marshaled here to make people pay for basic science. And although people don't like paying taxes, the benefits of the basic science outweigh the costs of the taxes, and it's worth doing. I follow that argument. I respect that argument. What is it about government's ability to coerce us that somehow makes them able to assure quality and safety of dentists and plumbers and carpenters? They don't know anything about those people's quality and safety. If you want to build an argument, a market failure argument for why the government's unique power of coercion is beneficial, it's got to make some sense that that coercion can be deployed in a way that delivers real benefits. The problem here is that the government actually has no special knowledge. It's just keeping people out. It's not generating a real solution, if you think about it. There's different ways to liberalize. We can go into that if you like. I think I've talked long enough. Yeah, so let me open it up for questions. Yeah.
You talked about the transitional gain strap. So in Germany we have a so-called generation contract for pensions that like the younger or the workers, current workers pay in and you pay the old workers out of it. Do you think that's some of this, or that's like similar with the transitional gain strap?
I believe it is. Let me see if I get this right. The younger people would start being defined contribution pensions. Meanwhile, you continue to pay off the old folks on the old. Yeah. Yes, it's a way to try to deal with a transitional gain problem, absolutely, or transitional loss problem. Yeah. you know, the government gets us, a lot of these bad government interventions have gotten us into these very troublesome situations, created interest groups to protect the way it is, and yeah, it's hard to undo. Yes.
Couldn't one argue that there isn't a transitional gains problem on the grounds that people who know those who are currently in the in-group of the licensing committee, that they could use their connections to make it easier for them to get into the business? So the transitional gains problem isn't there for them, because while they still have a higher barrier to entry than they would without the licensing situation, they still have lower barriers to entry than people who are outside of it.
You're saying the gains are not merely in the transition?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that could well be. It's not as simple as Tulloch's little description. I think Tulloch's little description, which kind of simplifies it, makes the start case of the gains being only in the transition, is very useful and a good benchmark. But yeah, I think you're right that that's an oversimplification. And probably in real life, there are different ways in which people do find special easy access to get through the requirements. I guess that's what you're getting at. Yeah, I think that's true. Let me add that there's another dimension of the transitional gains story, Tulloch's story, that isn't capped, there's another thing about real life, I think, that I don't think Tulloch's story captures. And that's that besides income, some people want this, you know, badge from the government. Some people like being anointed. And so even though they have to go through all the costs of getting education and passing all the exams, they still get something which maybe they really like as people. Maybe that's not a really healthy thing to like. Maybe it's something that kind of feels like puts them over other people, so maybe it's a positionality benefit to them in the sense that other people are now without that privilege and special deputization of government on high. You see what I'm saying? And so even the later generations might benefit from being, you know, one of government's anointed servants or authorities, right? And that's not captured in Tulloch's story. I don't think that makes for a strong argument to have this system to indulge certain people's preferences for being an appointed authority. I don't think that's a healthy culture. I think that has other ramifications. It kind of diminishes other people in a way. So I don't think it makes for a good argument for occupational licensing, but it is something important about benefits to current licensed practitioners. Do you see what I'm saying? No. Yes? Yeah.
Well, not that I disagree with what you're saying, but it seems some, you know, in Louisiana a while back, and it went to the Supreme Court, we had the casket case. Are you familiar with that one?
Well, one of the casket studies is referenced here. It might be this.
This is the one where after Katrina, the brothers at the monks on the North Shore, they used to sell lumber to, you know, make a living for themselves. The trees got knocked down, so they still had some, so they said, we'll make caskets. And of course, the funeral industry, you have to be a licensed funeral director and all that. Went all the way to Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, no, these guys can make caskets and sell them without being licensed funeral directors. And we also had in Louisiana, I don't know if we still do, one about cutting, flower arranging. And the idea that, you know, if somebody came in with a lump when it died and you messed up the floral arrangements, you know, untold psychological damage. There's a difference between things like that where even if there is damage because you didn't make the coffin right or something, and say, like your father, medical services where, you know, a surgeon, if you don't get it right, you kill somebody, okay? So I'm wondering if you see any difference between cases where you have, you know, palpable and severe harm if somebody screws up and something where it's not. And the other thing I would ask you is, would you throw out all licensing restrictions, every single one? Or are there any you would keep?
All right, let me ask you, let me respond to the first question first. The fact that for flower arrangement it's absurd and patently obvious that it's ridiculous, I do think it speaks to a certain level of indignation we should feel towards it. Even if the case for the surgeons is, in the end, not any more justified, that justification is so much harder to show, assuming that it is, that, you know, that this Adam Smith position is right, that it's not cause for indignation about it. So I think that the conversation should be is affected accordingly. On whether it is justified, should we have licensing for surgeons and such, the thing about the importance of the activity cuts both ways. I mean, if we have higher prices, less supply, less innovation, right, that also kills people. So the high stakes is on both sides of the cost-benefit judgment. And I still believe that the more natural incentives of private agreement, private contract, voluntary associations, and all the sorts of voluntary institutions and assurances, as well as the court system, you know, doctors are constantly fighting off lawyers. I'm not talking about, you know, making malpractice okay. That's still enough that the costs of restriction are greater than the benefits of restriction. So I would also chuck surgeon licensing, yes. I'll bite the bullet. I'm an abolitionist on this one. On occupational licensing, I'm comfortable saying that. Let me just qualify that by saying that I'm talking about the government restricting what private parties decide between each other, freedom of association. I'm not necessarily saying that the government, in running some of the operations it runs, shouldn't say our people need to have certain credentials. They're more like one big employer, and an employer, of course, might decide that it wants to assure quality with certain credentials. So I'm not necessarily, you know, rejecting the government ever requiring certifications, credentials for people it employs in its operations, for example, right? But yeah, otherwise, basically, I'm an abolitionist on this, just like William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist. I'm all on fire. Yeah.
Yeah, in supporting your case, have there ever been studies to compare the level of assurance from something like Angie's List to state licensing?
Those studies certainly exist, and with Angie's List and all the things, those are happening. I'm not following it closely enough to report, but yeah, that's certainly going on. I mean, I don't know that I've seen studies of Uber yet, but generally speaking, I think people feel that the mutual two-sided rating system is working quite well, and the boons from just the consumer surplus boons, plus the producer surplus of all the people gaining from providing the service, is tremendous. So, yeah, again, you know, the thing about this assurance problem, it's pervasive. But you know, you always have the simple option of what this fellow said. What's your name?
Richard?
Mitchie?
Richard.
Richard, sorry, Richard. I won't eat it. I won't eat it. You know, I haven't had enough assurance yet. I'm not going to eat it. I'm not going to eat that plate of food I find on the sidewalk. And who is the, you know, this is about the rule of experts. Who is the expert in Richard? The expert in Richard is Richard. So if you want the rule of experts, let individuals make these decisions for themselves, which might mean that they decide to ask a doctor, or ask a specialist, ask an inspector, etc. Ask their professor. They want assurance of this book's quality, so they're going to ask their professor. So yeah, I mean, it's scary to say let's not bother with the surgeons, but look, if someone needs surgery, they're highly motivated to ask those questions and to sort of restrict the people who can supply them, just like in the pharmaceuticals case, which is tragic. It cuts both ways. The body count from the FDA is huge. You know, you can say, oh, elixir sulfanilamide killed 137 children, and thalidomide maimed, all those European children. You know what? Those thousands of people are a drop in the bucket. I hate to make this grisly comparison, but they're a drop in the bucket of the people not getting life-saving drugs because of the suppression of innovation, because of the heavy, heavy restrictions on on getting permission to sell your drug. I don't want to shift this into the controversial FDA topic, but it's the same kind of story that cuts both ways. The seriousness of being on the operating table. Yes?
So, that's your hypothesis, and this is an answer to, might be an answer to Bill Barnett's question. It seems there might be two possible ways to do it. The first way would be to look historically at how bad or how good were medical services before the AMA and professional licensing of physicians occurred.
Right.
Did it really improve after professional licensing? I think from what I've read, it didn't. The point of inflection in medical services was like in 1920. Before that, it didn't matter who the doctor was. You probably didn't get bad care, right, until the technology caught up. But that you could compare now. It seems to me that if you have like a profession that is regulated in one state but not regulated in another state, then the comparison you had was that it seems the other side of the coin would be to study where does the insurance being provided in the states that don't have professional license? There should be, according to the law, there should be an entrepreneur who provides the information if it's available. In other words, the credential. I'm going to be a surgeon. I can go down and learn from a barber downtown into a barber surgeon, so I can go to a school with great surgeons in it. There could be. I could provide it, I could invest and provide it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you understand my question? Have there been a lot of studies along those lines as well?
Of that historical nature.
Well, today and historically.
There are studies, to be sure. I think some of the cross-sectional stuff that I flipped through gets into some of that, in fact. Like some of them kind of tell stories about where it's licensed and there's less competition, they actually have more incentive to defraud customers and cheat customers and overprice things, because after all, the customer has fewer choices to turn to, fewer options to turn to, like in TV repair. There's a famous study about, I think it was the FTC. They broke the TV and they acted like somebody undercover. It's just they brought the TV. And see if the TVs were correctly fixed, because they broke them. They knew what needed fixing. So anyhow, do you want to add? Sure, back.
Well, the way I deal with this in my life is, if you want to get automobile repair or appliance repair, you ask somebody.
Of course.
A plumber. You don't just you don't care. I never ask for the license unless I have to. You ask my name.
Yeah, gossip has always been a vital source of reputation. It's the way the world functions. Gossip has a bad name, but gossip is vitally important.
You can't measure that.
Yeah, it's hard to measure.
No one's going to
It's hard to track, and it's hard to point to as in an argument. That gossip's going to work, reputation's going to work, but we have so many ways of doing that. All these ways of organizing service, bringing practitioners under a brand name into an organization, a clinic, a hospital, a group practice. Those are all new. The purpose of that is not just economies of scale and shuffling papers or making appointments. It's creating a brand name which then has this assurance power. And they are assuring the people under their brand name. When Loyola hires Nick Capaldi, Nick gains by getting the assurance that Loyola just gave him.
Higher check, it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. Well, that happens too. That happens too. It goes both ways. And this happens, when Christian Bale takes a role in a movie, he's certifying that movie. You take that movie more seriously because Christian Bale has taken a role in the movie. Assurance is all around us. Anyhow, you also mentioned the historical issue. Yeah, on the medical profession, it's awful complicated, because, well, first of all, because medicine has developed so much in the last 100 years, 150 years, that it's a little hard to make those comparisons. You know, there were all these medical schools which were then closed down with the increased licensing requirements. One of the very important practices that got shut down, it wasn't necessarily the highest quality, but sometimes low quality is better than going without. And that's the lodge practice of fraternal societies, fraternal lodges that provided medical services, other sorts of social insurances through membership in these fraternal lodges, you know, like the Lions Club and Kiwanis and all of these, they were pervasive up until the 1920s, 1930s. They were huge. David Beto says that as much as 30% of, I think, men were members in the country. I think that's right. So they were totally pervasive, and people were getting basic services. And then the medical profession shut down the lodge practice evil, as they called it. So again, there's the cost side of this that have to be taken very seriously. Yeah.
Just one question. As far as access to not only services but economic opportunity is concerned,
Yeah.
Occupational licensing is one barrier to entry.
Yes.
What are others? If you can.
Others, I would say union privileges are a significant one. The minimum wage is one for low-skilled, very low-skilled people. You know, young people. I think there's all sorts of important land use restrictions that matter a lot. What would be something you would add?
Zoning?
Zoning, yeah. I think school is the terrible state of schooling. That's not exactly the same kind of restriction, but a huge problem. But you know, I do think that these problems very much pertain to the unrest that we see in society of people not having thriving, you know, hopeful jobs and lives, and resorting to unrest and violence even, because these avenues, these many varied avenues, are closed off. You know, back in the day, back when, you know, my ancestors came to this country from Eastern Europe, this would be like late 1800s, you know, they could just start working. They just, you know, went to work. Back in those days, I guess when the cars came, you know, if you wanted to be a taxi cab driver, you got a car and you got a bucket of paint, you wrote taxi on it, as Walter Williams likes to explain. And you went to work, and you've maybe learned a little bit. You learned what you liked, you learned what you were good at, you made connections. That was, you know, America in those old days. A great, you know, world of opportunity. And so many of those rungs from the ladder have been cut off. And it's creating a different kind of world where a lot of people are sort of getting trapped without really getting onto the first rung. The now quite high first rung kind of problem.
And just a follow-up question. I guess you can't really empirically measure what might have been per se, but you spoke to a slowing of innovative processes.
The slowing of
innovation?
Yeah.
Because of occupational licensing? My question would be, for example, in a community that comprises the bottom 20% of the country economically, where a person may have will and vision to succeed in a certain capacity, but finds that they're perpetually inhibited by these barriers and ends up having to take 3 minimum wage jobs and doing a 50-hour work week. The person in less or in more fortunate circumstances, simply by extrapolation of the latter example, has the means to pay their way around it.
Yeah, mommy and daddy's boosting them up, yeah.
Right. And so what we end up, this is actually a source of exponentially growing income inequality, you would argue, that
Yeah.
occupational licensing.
I don't know about exponentially growing, but yes, I think it creates more inequality in makes it persist more, creates more of that matching phenomenon that we're getting.
Thank you. That's all I need.
One of the most dramatic examples of this came from Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, and he says that in 1930s, Jewish doctors in Vienna were like the best doctors. And he looks at the immigration of Jews from Vienna, not just doctors, but economists, physicists, everything. And he finds that there's no more new doctors in the years before and after there was mass immigration, right before Hitler took over, whereas physicists, mathematicians all got jobs, whereas the Jewish doctors had to become taxi cab drivers. And then the same thing happened in Cuba, when there was this massive movement of Cubans, intellectual Cubans from Cuba to the US. And again, the economists and the physicists, the mathematicians, the chemists all got jobs in their field, whereas the Cuban doctors ended up driving taxi cabs because we economists, shame on us, don't have good entry restrictions, whereas the doctors do. But this is a very dramatic way of putting the case that they've got, I think Milton Friedman called them the strongest union of all, because they start you right before medical school. Whereas in other cases, people know what they're doing, whereas if you haven't been to medical school, you're not yet a doctor. They restrict the number of medical schools and the number of entrants into the extant medical schools.
Right. Yeah, so the medical schools are sort of working hand in glove with the licensing requirements. To get the license, you have to have gone to one of these accredited schools, which are few in number, and as Professor Block says, limit their intake. So they're like working as a kind of cartel. And now you might wonder, well, how does the guy from Cuba or the guy from Austria, like how do people really know whether he's a good doctor? Again, this is where I think we should let, the individual choose for himself, including the individuals on the supply side. Some people will be kind of savvy about these Austrian doctors, people in the medical profession. Maybe they'll bring them into their clinics, group practices, hospitals, and certify them because they have trust in them, and then help that person get started by being under one of those brand names or groups or organizations. So there's ways to do it. I mean, you think, well, gee, how do we know about these strange Cuban doctors? But there's ways it happens, and people are motivated to make it happen. There's profit in having the Cuban doctor, or serve your customers if you're a medical group. And so there's ways to make it happen without obviously making them get licenses. The result of which is that they don't very often, and they waste their great talents, and everyone gets less good things because they're driving a taxi. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to get awesome lecture. And now I have two questions. So first question, it's about reputation. I think you had this conversation about reputation earlier. So reputation works in, we all know, economists know that reputation works in small, homogeneous society with repeated interactions, right? What Adam Smith called the nature of continuous dealings. But we also, all economists know that reputation breaks down without repeated interactions in large and non-homogeneous society. So the question is, how do we overcome this problem without occupational license? And second question is actually about Richard. Use Richard as an example. So Richard doesn't want to eat it if he finds food on the floor, he doesn't want to eat it because, well, he's Richard, he goes to private school. But what if Richard is homeless and he's actually, it's not that easy for him to find food anywhere else because he can't afford it. So in my understanding, there is another problem with occupational licensing. Actually, the same problem as with minimum wage. It hurts poor people more. Because what occupational licensing does, if you guys still remember demand and supply curves, you should think about it. So occupational licensing increases prices, right? So as a result, it makes it more affordable to wealthier customers. but poor customers, they drop out from the market. So it's not only Cuban doctors who can be doctors, but it's also people who can just see doctors anymore, who can't afford it. So are there any studies about the effect on poor? That's my second question. And is anyone trying to tell the story that, look, it's actually there's poor more, we need to poorer?
Yeah. You're absolutely right, of course, about the going without. That did come up, but yeah, it deserves more discussion. Sometimes Milton Friedman said that occupational licensing creates kind of a Cadillac effect. You know, Cadillac is a high-quality car, and he was saying that, you know, it says a car has to be this high quality and all the other ones have to be removed from the market. If you're not a Cadillac, you're not allowed on the market. Well, a lot of us don't drive Cadillacs, right? And so if you cut out the bottom part of the market, you're hurting all the people who can afford only the bottom part of the market. Exactly. Now, I just want to add that it's not actually true that I think that occupational licensing is like helping to create Cadillacs. As we showed or discussed, the quality evidence, they don't actually increase quality that much when you do cross-sectional comparisons and other things. But you're right. You know, people are, if someone's starving, maybe they would eat the plate on the sidewalk, okay? And I wouldn't be one to say that shouldn't be allowed. I mean, I'm not going to stand there and say, no, you're not allowed to eat, you know, the food out there in the wild or whatever. And if you do that, again, why don't you let that person, let's say his name is Joe, it's not Richard, because he wouldn't be Joe. The expert in Joe is Joe. The expert in Joe is Joe. And if Joe is not very expert in Joe, how's he going to learn to be an expert in himself, in his world, his opportunities, his constraints, his desires, his aspirations? By exercising that choice for himself. So even if Joe isn't such a great expert in Joe, the only hope we have is to give him the freedom to make those choices, I think. The only hope for a better Joe, that is. So, yeah, I think you're right about the bottom end. You asked about the big society, non-anonymous, big world. That's being dealt with all the time, every day. That's what brand names are doing. That's what retailers do. Rite Aid. I passed Rite Aid on the way over here. You know, retailers are ways of breaking down the relationship you have with, say, Pfizer, the drug maker. Like, what do you know about this particular ulcer medication? I've never taken it before, I've never bought anything from Pfizer, I'm not an expert in ulcer, but it's on the shelf at Rite Aid. That is a seal of approval. Rite Aid has helped assure that product. It helps assure to you, the Rite Aid customer, every single product on Rite Aid's shelf. So this is going on just in the way that commerce is organized. It's going on in franchises. You know, in every motel, you pull off the highway and you check into a Motel 6 or a Holiday Inn. Complete strangers. You know, maybe they're named Norman Bates. Oh, but it's a Motel 6. Motel 6 wouldn't hire Norman Bates. Norman Bates wouldn't work for Motel 6. He likes to keep his mother nearby. They don't have a big creepy house behind every Hotel 6. So we have all these ways of doing it. It's just that people don't, it's hard to see what is happening, Leo, as I know you know. Around us in many, many complicated ways, in subtle ways, but I think the incentives are on the whole right, and freedom is still the way to go. Adam Smith taught that we should have a presumption of liberty, that maybe not in every single case, I know Walter will disagree, maybe not in every single case, liberty is the best policy, or more liberty is the right choice. There might be exceptions. Adam Smith made some exceptions, but he bore the burden of proof. He said, these overcome the presumption. Well, at least he taught that way. I don't want to give the impression that he used that phraseology exactly. That the general presumption, like the presumption of innocence, is for liberty. you know, the presumption of innocence in the courtroom. How does that work? The defendant is presumed innocent, and the burden of proof is on the prosecution to show guilt. And Adam Smith taught, and this was the whole, you know, way that economics from there on got going, liberty deserves a presumption. If someone wants to intervene and restrict liberty, as occupational licensing does, they should bear the burden of proof. It is so far from bearing that burden. It's not close. Maybe some of these other things are closer. You know, maybe we make some exceptions like Adam Smith did. But occupational licensing is actually, I think if you do your homework, not close. Yet we have it. Culture's changed. But anyhow, since Adam Smith, anyway, especially the leading intellectual culture. Any final comments? I know we're in that.